the shadow of midnight. The kingdom of Virelia was wrapped in an eternal frost, its castles and fields cloaked in a snow that never melted. The air hummed with the faintest whispers of magic, old and brittle, like the echoes of forgotten songs. Within the gilded halls of the royal palace, the grand New Year's Eve celebration roared on, the revelers oblivious to the somber figure slipping through the shadows of the ballroom. Princess Isolde stood near the towering glass windows, her reflection fractured by the frost creeping across the panes. She could feel the weight of her crown, heavy not with jewels, but with duty. Her father's decree hung over her like a blade poised to strike. At dawn, she would be bound in betrothal to Prince Adric of Montreal, a man with eyes like cold steel and ambitions to match. She knew her fate was sealed, her life bartered for alliances and power. But Isolde's heart burned with rebellion. She longed for freedom, for a life unchained from duty and expectation. Her mother, long gone, had once whispered to her of ancient magic hidden in the forbidden hollow, a place where shadows and secrets thrived. Isolde had dismissed those stories as fairy tales meant to soothe a child's restless mind. Yet tonight, with the weight of inevitability pressing down on her, those tales felt like a lifeline. The bells began to toll, their deep, resonant chimes echoing through the palace. Midnight was drawing near. The revelers raised their goblets in unison, their voices a crescendo of laughter and cheer. Isolde used the chaos to her advantage, slipping away through the side doors and into the biting cold of the winter night. The path to the forbidden hollow was whispered of, but never mapped. Yet the stories her mother had told seemed to guide her steps. The snow crunched beneath her boots, each step a defiance against the life she was fleeing. The wind howled like a mourning spirit, tugging at her cloak as if to pull her back. The woods grew denser, the gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The air was colder here, thick, with an unnatural stillness. Isolde's breath came in plumes of white, her pulse quickening as she pressed deeper into the heart of the forest. There, in a clearing bathed in faint moonlight, she found it. A mirror half buried in the snow, its frame twisted like the roots of an ancient tree. The mirror seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in her bones. Its surface was not glass, but a shimmering black void, as if it had swallowed the very essence of the night. Isolde approached cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the frame, a voice emerged, a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You seek freedom, but do you understand its cost? Isolde's breath hitched, her reflection rippling like water. For a moment she saw herself, not as the fragile girl fleeing her destiny, but as something more, radiant, untethered, powerful. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She took a step closer, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her words forming clouds in the icy air. The voice laughed softly, the sound like the chime of distant bells. A shadow, a whisper, a fairy of the hollow. "Call me what you will, princess, but know this, I can offer you what you desire most, freedom power, a rewritten fate. The mirror flickered again, showing fleeting images of a life she had only dreamed of, a throne of her own, a kingdom blooming under her rule, her laughter unburdened by duty. It was a vision so vivid, so intoxicating, that it felt like a promise. But all gifts have a price, the voice continued, its tone shifting to something darker. The ink of fate is written in shadows. Do you dare to make the pact? The bells rang their final toll in the distance. Midnight had come and gone, and with it, the moment of decision. Isolde stood before the mirror, the cold biting at her skin, her reflection waiting. The shadows seemed to stretch closer, their forms twisting and writhing in anticipation. She stepped forward, her voice steady as she whispered, "Yes." The forbidden hollow seemed to breathe around her, the trees swaying unnaturally despite the stillness of the air. The black surface of the mirror pulsed faintly, as though it were alive, as though it could sense her presence. Princess Isolde hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She had made her choice, spoken the word aloud, but the reality of it now pressed down on her like the weight of a crown made of ice. You do not yet understand the depths of your desire, the shadowy voice murmured, its tone soft and coaxing. Before the pact is forged, you must gaze into the mirror. Only then will you see the truth of what you seek. Isolde's hand hovered over the frame. It felt cold as death, yet strangely magnetic, as if her very soul were drawn to it. She peered into the surface, and at first it reflected only her, a pale girl cloaked in velvet, her face shadowed by the doubts and fears she carried. But then the reflection shifted. The forest around her melted away, replaced by a vision of what could be. In the mirror, she stood atop a grand dais, a crown of gold and sapphires upon her head. The throne she sat upon was not her father's, cold and oppressive, but one of her own making, its design elegant and unyielding. Around her, a court of loyal followers bowed, and their faces filled with admiration. The air in this vision was thick with power, her laughter ringing clear and unburdened. This was a life without duty, without constraint, a life where she answered to no one. The vision gripped her like a spell, her heart pounding at the thought of breaking free from the chains of her birthright. She whispered, her voice trembling, This is what I want." The shadow laughed, a sound both soft and menacing. "Then it shall be yours. But freedom demands sacrifice. The ink with which fate is rewritten must be drawn from you." The reflection darkened, and the Isolde in the mirror reached out, her hand brushing against the frame from the other side. The shadow's voice surrounded her, weaving through her thoughts like smoke. "Your memory, princess. A single moment, a fragment of your soul. Choose wisely. What will you leave behind in the hollow's grasp?" Isolde's mind raced, the weight of the choice suffocating her. Her memories were all she had left of her mother, who had died when she was just a child. Her father's love had turned cold, her future bound to a marriage of convenience. But her mother's voice, the lullabies sung in soft, lilting tones, had been her sanctuary. Yet, as the reflection in the mirror stood taller, more confident, Isolde felt a pang of longing that eclipsed her doubts. The memory of her mother's lullabies, comforting as they were, belonged to a life she was desperate to escape. With tears prickling her eyes, she whispered, "I will give you the song, the one my mother sang to me." The mirror shimmered, its surface rippling like water. The shadow spoke again, its voice tinged with something like satisfaction. "A tender offering, princess. The pact is sealed." The frame glowed faintly as Isolde pressed her palm against it. A sharp pain shot through her hand, as if the mirror itself had bitten her. She pulled back to find her palm cut, a thin line of blood trailing down her wrist. The reflection grinned, a strange, knowing smile, before it began to dissolve. Around her, the forest seemed to tilt and spin, the trees stretching like shadows cast by an unseen light. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and the snow swirled upward in a violent storm. Isolde fell to her knees, clutching her chest as the cold seeped into her bones. Her mother's lullaby, the melody that had always lingered in the back of her mind, faded like a candle snuffed out by the wind. As the storm subsided, the forbidden hollow was no more. In its place rose a palace unlike any she had ever seen, its spires piercing the sky, its walls glittering as if carved from crystal. Isolde stood at the edge of a grand courtyard, her breath catching as the world settled into focus. She wore a gown of deep indigo, her shoulders adorned with jewels that sparkled like starlight. The weight of a crown pressed upon her head, not her father's, but her own. "Welcome to your new life," the shadow's voice echoed faintly, its tone both mocking and triumphant. "You have rewritten your fate. But remember, princess, shadows linger where light dares to shine." Isolde stepped forward, her heart beating with a strange mix of triumph and unease. The memory of her mother's song was gone, replaced by a gnawing void. For the first time, she wondered if freedom could ever come without a price. The dawn broke in muted hues of silver and ash, filtering through the towering windows of a palace Isolde now called her own. Her breath caught as she moved through the halls, her footsteps echoing against marble floors that gleamed with an unnatural sheen. Each step felt like walking through a dream, a haze that shimmered just beyond comprehension. The faces of those she passed blurred and shifted, their smiles adoring but hollow, like reflections in a warped mirror. At the far end of the grand hall, a throne waited, hers alone. She climbed its steps, the hem of her indigo gown brushing against gold-inlaid marble, and sat, feeling the chill of its metal embrace. Outside the towering glass walls, her kingdom stretched endlessly, a land untouched by frost, blooming with verdant life and whispers of prosperity. It was a vision of perfection, a reflection of her deepest desires made real. But the shadows lingered. As the hours passed, Isolde's triumph began to sour. The faces of her courtiers remained unfamiliar, their words flowing around her like a river she could not wade into. She listened, nodded, and gave commands. But the air between them felt as thin and fragile as ice. Her words carried weight, yet they seemed to dissolve before reaching her subjects' hearts. They bowed and obeyed, yet their smiles never quite reached their eyes. That night, as the moon cast its pale light over her chamber, she stared into the polished glass of her vanity. The reflection that greeted her was familiar yet distant, a queen radiant with power, but shadowed by something unspoken. Her gaze flickered to the edges of the room, where the darkness seemed thicker, almost alive. And then she felt it, a presence. "You wear your crown well, my queen," came the shadowy voice, soft and serpentine, weaving through the quiet of the room. Isolde turned sharply, her pulse quickening as the figure of the fairy materialized from the corner of the room, its form flickering like a dying flame. Its face was not fully formed, a blur of sharp angles and shadow, but its eyes gleamed like molten silver. "You," Isolde hissed, her voice low and sharp. "What do you want?" The fairy tilted its head, the gesture almost playful. "I come not to take, but to remind. Do you feel the freedom you long for, princess? Does the weight of your crown not sit lighter than the chains of duty?" Isolde rose to her feet, the fire in her chest sparking against the cold of her unease. "This isn't what I imagined. The people, the court. It's also hollow." The fairy chuckled, the sound as soft and biting as winter's breath. "Hollow? No, dear queen. It is you who feels hollow, for you traded more than a memory. You gave away the anchor to your heart, the melody that tethered you to warmth. Without it, the shadows creep in." The words struck her like a blade. Isolde pressed a hand to her chest, her breath shallow. She could no longer hear the soft hum of her mother's lullaby, the song that had once filled her dreams with comfort. It was gone, ripped from her soul, leaving a void that nothing seemed to fill. "Give it back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The memory, the song. I didn't know it would feel like this." The fairy's silver eyes narrowed. Memories cannot simply be returned. What is taken becomes part of the shadow, woven into its threads. If you wish to reclaim it, you must undo the life you have rewritten. Are you willing to cast aside the power, the freedom you sought? Isolde faltered, her heart warring with itself. To return to the life she had left behind meant surrendering everything she had gained: the throne, the autonomy, the kingdom that thrived beneath her rule. Yet the emptiness inside her was growing, a gnawing void that no crown could fill. The fairy stepped closer, its form shimmering like a heat wave against the cold. "Freedom comes at a price, Isolde. You must decide which holds greater value, the dream you sought or the song you've lost. But be warned, Queen of Shadows, time is fleeting and midnight waits for no one." With that, the fairy dissolved into the air, leaving Isolde alone in the dim glow of the moonlight. She sank back into her chair, her mind racing. The kingdom stretched out beyond her window, shimmering with possibilities. But it felt more like a cage with every passing moment. As the bells of midnight began to toll in the distance, Isolde clutched the arms of her throne, her knuckles white with tension. She had made a pact at the edge of light, but the shadows it cast were longer and darker than she had ever anticipated. The days blurred into one another, the vibrant kingdom around Isolde only sharpening the dull ache within her. She ruled with poise and authority, yet the throne's grandeur now felt like a gilded cage. Every corner of her palace shimmered with beauty, every subject bent willingly to her will, but no amount of adoration could fill the hollow where her mother's lullaby had once resided. The shadow's words haunted her. Memories cannot simply be returned. What is taken becomes part of the shadow. Each night, she sought answers in the silence of her chambers, searching for something, anything, that could bring her solace. But her efforts were in vain, the void in her heart growing deeper with every passing day. As winter's chill seeped into the palace walls, Isolde began to notice things she had not seen before. The faces of her courtiers no longer blurred, but their eyes were glassy, devoid of the spark that made them feel real. The laughter that echoed through the halls was hollow, as though it belonged to phantoms rather than living beings. Even the vibrant lands she gazed upon from her throne seemed too perfect, their beauty marred by an unnatural stillness. The realization struck her like a thunderclap. Her kingdom was a reflection of her desires, a construct of her pact. It was not a true kingdom, but a shadow of what could have been, built on the sacrifice of her mother's song. And like all shadows, it lacked substance. On the eve of a bitter winter storm, Isolde sat alone in the grand hall, her throne bathed in moonlight. The silence was deafening, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had lost. As the winds howled outside, the shadows at the edges of the room began to stir, coiling like smoke caught in a draught. And then it appeared, the shadowy fairy, its form wavering like a reflection on rippling water. Its eyes glimmered with silver light, their gaze piercing and unrelenting. "You have summoned me," the fairy said, its voice smooth and chilling. "Have you come to embrace your triumph, or to lament the cost of your dreams?" Isolde rose from her throne, her jaw tight. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You knew I would feel this emptiness." The fairy tilted its head, its lips curving into a faint smile. "All who seek to rewrite their fate must pay the price. It is not I who dictated the cost, but your own heart. You chose to part with the song that tethered you to warmth, and now you reap the consequences." "Then undo it," Isolde demanded, stepping forward. "Take it all back. This throne, this kingdom. I want none of it if it means living without her song." The fairy's smile faltered, its expression hardening. "Undoing the pact will not return what you've lost as you remember it. The shadows have claimed the memory, weaving it into their fabric. To break the pact is to risk unraveling far more than your rewritten life. Do you truly wish to tempt the unknown?" Isolde hesitated, her fists clenching at her sides. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, a suffocating reminder of how far she had fallen. Could she risk everything to reclaim the melody of her mother's love, even if it meant destroying the life she had built? The fairy stepped closer, its presence casting the room in an eerie glow. "You stand at a crossroads, Queen of Shadows. To linger in this kingdom is to live a dream turned nightmare, a life of hollow triumph, but to unravel the pact is to face the chaos of the unknown. Which path will you choose? The room fell silent, save for the faint toll of the palace's midnight bells. Isolde's gaze fell to the ground, her thoughts a maelstrom of doubt and longing. She thought of her mother's lullaby, the gentle tune that had once guided her through the darkest nights. The memory of it had faded, but the ache it left behind was a reminder of what truly mattered. Finally, she looked up, her eyes blazing with resolve. "I will take that risk," she said, her voice firm. "I will reclaim what I've lost, no matter the cost." The fairy regarded her for a long moment, its silver eyes unreadable. Then it bowed its head, its form beginning to dissolve into a wisp of smoke. "Very well," it said, its voice fading like a dying ember. "But know this, Isolde, shadows always leave their mark." As the last toll of midnight echoed through the hall, the palace around her began to tremble. The walls shimmered, their solidity dissolving into darkness, and the world as she knew it began to unravel. Isolde stood firm, her heart racing but unyielding, as the shadows closed in around her. The world unraveled into darkness, a vortex of shadows that consumed the throne, the palace, and the lands she had called her own. Isolde stood in the heart of it, her pulse steady despite the chaos swirling around her. The shadowy fairy's words echoed in her mind. Shadows always leave their mark. She closed her eyes as the final thread of her kingdom dissolved, bracing herself for what lay beyond the void. When the silence came, it was absolute. Isolde opened her eyes to find herself standing once again in the forbidden hollow. The air was colder now, the snow biting against her skin. The mirror lay before her, its twisted frame frosted over, but its surface no longer shimmered with dark promises. Instead, it reflected nothing, an empty void where even her image dared not appear. "You have undone what was written," the fairy's voice came from behind her, quieter now, tinged with a strange melancholy. Isolde turned to see it standing at the edge of the clearing, its form no longer imposing, but fragile, its silver eyes dimmed. Yet the shadows do not relinquish their hold so easily. What you seek will not be as you remember. "I don't care," Isolde said, her voice resolute. "I will reclaim it. Whatever is left of her song, I will make it mine again." The fairy tilted its head, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at its lips. "So be it." The mirror shuddered, its surface rippling as if struck by an unseen force. Slowly an image began to form, a fragment of her mother's lullaby, faint and distorted, drifting like smoke through the void. Isolde felt a pang in her chest, the ache of longing returning tenfold. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the cold glass. "Before you touch it," the fairy whispered, stepping closer, "understand this. The shadow has claimed part of it. The melody you remember will be incomplete, its warmth forever tinged with the darkness it passed through. Are you willing to embrace a memory tainted by shadow, knowing it will never be whole?" Isolde hesitated, her hand hovering over the mirror. The thought of her mother's voice, twisted and incomplete, sent a shiver down her spine. Yet she knew that to walk away now would mean losing it forever. She closed her eyes, drawing in a deep breath. Even a fragment of her song is worth more than a kingdom of lies. Her fingers brushed the surface of the mirror, and the void consumed her. When she awoke, Isolde was no longer in the forbidden hollow. She lay in her childhood bed, the canopy above her draped in familiar blue silk. The faint scent of lavender filled the air, a comfort she hadn't realized she had missed. She sat up slowly, her heart racing as she took in the room around her. Everything was as it had been before: the tapestries, the worn rug by the hearth, the frost tracing delicate patterns on the window. But something was different. She touched her chest, feeling a strange heaviness there. The memory of her mother's lullaby stirred within her, but it was fractured. The melody came to her in fits and starts, the once smooth notes now jagged and unfamiliar. It was like hearing a beloved tune played on a broken instrument, recognizable but unwhole. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of despair. She hummed the pieces of the song she could remember, her voice trembling as she pieced them together. Though incomplete, the melody carried a weight that felt real, grounding her in a way her false kingdom never had. As she finished the final broken notes, a warmth spread through her chest, faint but steady. It was the shadow's mark, a reminder of her choices, her losses, and the cost of her freedom. Yet it was also proof that she had endured, that even in the face of loss, she had reclaimed something that was hers. The sound of distant bells drew her attention. Rising, Isolde moved to the window and looked out over the palace courtyard. Snow blanketed the ground, and torches flickered as servants prepared for the New Year's celebration. Life continued, unchanged by her journey into the hollow. As the final bell tolled, she whispered to herself, "Freedom isn't rewriting fate, it's finding the courage to live within it." She turned from the window, her heart lighter even as the shadow lingered. The lullaby, though fractured, would guide her forward, a testament to what she had lost and what she had reclaimed. And with each passing year, as the bells of midnight echoed once more, she would sing its broken melody, a reminder that even in imperfection, there was beauty. For Isolde, the shadows had left their mark, but they had also illuminated the truth. Freedom was never about escaping fate, but about embracing the light and the darkness within it.